Hi, my name is Lisa Marker Robbins, and I am the founding CEO of LEAP. We work with college-bound students to get them into their best fit college and future career. A big part of that is ACT and SAT testing. And so there's a lot of confusion this year because what has been the case for the class of 2021 is not true for this year's juniors, the class of 2022. So we are here to help educate families to cut the confusion so they can work towards best scores that they will need to get into their best fit college. So we're here to help you make your dreams happen. In my estimation, there are actually 6 levels of test optional schools. So for the first category, this actually, for the class of 2021, this year's seniors, happens to be the smallest group. These are schools that are test required. It's only a handful of schools like Georgia Tech, the Florida Publics, schools like that. Why are most of the schools for the class of 2021 test optional? Due to COVID, we found that students had a hard time getting test sites available, this year's seniors, in time for their college applications. COVID's still rampant in many parts of the country, and we're even seeing surges right now. That has created limited testing opportunities. So therefore, most colleges have done some version of test optional for the class of 2021, but as we're going to illustrate for you, that is not necessarily true for the class of 2022. The class of 2022, this year's juniors, really needs to work towards having a great plan in place to make sure that they are COVID-proof on their testing plan. Oops, didn't mean to advance yet. So the next group down is those schools that were what I call, and this is a Lisa term, nobody else's term, reluctantly test optional. In this category, for example, my home state would be Ohio State University. Signs that they were reluctantly test optional, that they would have preferred to still require the test, was they waited till very late in the game to say that they were going to be test optional. That was late June of this year. So schools that kind of waited till June or July, to even later in some cases, to say, hey, you know what, 2021, we're going to give you a break. We realize you've not been able to test so that you can go test optional. Those schools, a school like Ohio State. Another sign would be schools that move their deadline later. So Ohio State historically has had a November 1st deadline. They instead, this year, for the class of 2021, moved their application deadline to the middle of November, which allowed for students to take the late October ACT opportunities or the early November SAT, both in time to get your applications in. Those would be signs that they probably, in my estimation, would rather have your test scores. The next group down are those that they were probably early to the game. They maybe declared in March, April, or May that they were going to go ahead and pursue test optional for 1 year only. This is a large number of schools that will be illustrated on our next slide. So those schools, they said, hey, we know that you've got a problem here, and we're not going to get in your way. We won't consider test scores for this year. Now, the next group down are schools that probably have considered in the past whether they should still require test scores or allow students to go test optional. In my home state again, University of Cincinnati is running a 2-year test optional test drive. They're going to allow both the class of 2021 and 2022 to apply without ACT and SAT scores if they wish. We're going to talk in a minute about what test optional really means. Does it mean that you shouldn't submit test scores? So those schools that fall into this, and generally those are 1 to 3 year test drives, are saying we're going to then look at our data and decide, do we really need test scores in the future? And then we will make a permanent decision. Then we have schools that were already test optional or were planning to go test optional. Oregon would be one of these. They were planning already in late March to go test optional. Their announcement just happened to come weeks after COVID hit hard. So these are schools that firmly believe that they can make admission decisions without ACT and SAT scores and be fair to their students, and they have the information that they need to make a holistic review and then make an admission decision. And finally, the final group, which actually every other year besides this year is indeed the very smallest group, and it's still a very tiny group even this year, and I'm going to predict will be again in the future post-COVID, these are schools that are test blind. So test blind are schools that actually say, we see absolutely no value at all in having your ACT and SAT scores, and if you would submit them with your application, we will completely ignore them. They will not be part of our admission decision. I always get curious about the fact that the schools that are test optional, if they really feel like they don't need the scores, why wouldn't they just go test blind? That's been a mystery to me. So let's take an example of what we expect to have happen coming into this next year. So this is a screenshot from an organization, fairtest.org, F-A-I-R test.org. You can go to their website. They keep an ongoing cumulative list of all of the schools that are test optional when they became test optional. So I went to their list and I took the first 55 schools alphabetically. Honestly, it was just what could fit on my computer screen to do a screenshot. So I took the screenshot and then I went through, and everywhere where you see a yellow highlight, these are schools that will not, they are test optional for the class of 2021, but they will not be test optional for the class of 22. So this is the first 55 on their alphabetical list. So these weren't schools that I strategically chose. Went through, and only 16 of the schools of the first 55 alphabetically will still be test optional as of right now, will still be test optional beyond the class of 2021. So that means that only 29% of that list is going to remain test optional. Now, a bit of admissions advice, even for the class of 2021, if that's who's tuning in, and for those that are in the class of 2022 and younger. Generally speaking, if a school is test optional, they tell you that submitting scores could help you. The general rule of thumb is if you fall within their averages of test scores for who they admitted the previous year, then you can safely go ahead and submit your test scores. So that means you need to look up for each school through the web, this is easily found data, to see what their 25th to 75th percentiles are of the students who were admitted the previous year. If your ACT and SAT scores fall within that range of average, then you can safely assume that it is okay to submit your scores. So don't make the false assumption like one of my students who's applying to nursing schools did, and she said, oh, I don't have to submit my test scores anymore. All my schools are test optional. This was a conversation we had in June of 2020. And first of all, she didn't realize that for nursing programs, you aren't ever test optional. You have to submit scores. So that was a mistake. Secondly, she had a score into the 30s on her ACT. It was only going to help her and not hurt her to still go ahead and submit her scores. So test optional does not mean don't submit. It means if you feel that your scores don't measure up, then you can go ahead and safely apply to that college without scores. So we hope this clears this up for you and gives you clarity to make a good plan to maximize your test scores for the class of 2022.